Hi, my name is Matt Reagan, and I'm with the Dual Diagnosis Program here at Portage Path. What is dual diagnosis? Other terms that we use to describe dual diagnosis are dual disorders, co-occurring disorders, comorbidity, or SAMI. SAMI stands for substance abuse and mental illness, which describes what these dual diagnoses are. Basically, it is a combination of a mental illness, which would include bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, major depressive disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, combined with what we now call a substance use disorder. In the past, we described the substance use disorders as addictions, chemical dependency, substance abuse, substance dependence, alcoholism. We now call these substance use disorders. So again, the dual diagnosis specifically is a combination of what we would traditionally call a mental illness and then what we now call substance use disorders. And the term that I would like to emphasize today is a concept called comorbidity. We see this term used a lot in the media today related to our current health crisis. By definition, comorbidity means two or more illnesses that occur simultaneously. And the reason that we want to emphasize this is because we're going to try to describe these dual diagnoses, our mental illness and our substance use disorders, as illnesses. So in the end, what we'll say is that substance use disorder is just another mental illness. When we look at the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, that we use to describe mental illnesses, what we find is that substance use disorder is in that particular manual. So the field of psychiatry understands substance use disorder to be just another mental illness. And then in general, what we emphasize is that mental illness is just another medical condition. So we will emphasize this idea that we have illnesses. Three main reasons why this is important. Number one, it provides us an understanding of what's going on. And my belief is that understanding provides a powerful tool for the recovery process. Second of all, it gives us hope for recovery through our utilization of evidence-based practices. We know that treatment is effective for these illnesses. And number three, it goes a long way in reducing stigma and the shame behind these illnesses, which I believe is one of the major barriers to the treatment and recovery process. So how do we know that it's an illness? Well, when we look at illnesses, whether it's a medical condition or a psychiatric condition, they share certain characteristics. The first characteristic that all illnesses share is what we call a morbid process. Taking us back to that term that we described as comorbidity, or two illnesses occurring simultaneously. What the morbid process says is that with these illnesses, there is a specific organ or a system in the body that is not functioning properly. And we can see this with other illnesses, an example being a cardiovascular disease. With a cardiovascular disease, we see the heart as the specific organ that's being impaired, or the circulatory system, which is the system that this heart is a part of, actually experiencing a dysfunction as well. So here's where things get a little complicated with our dual diagnosis is the organ that we're seeing that's being impaired is the brain. And we will talk about the morbid process occurring in what are described as neurochemicals or brain chemistry. But at the same time, the system that we're describing is what we call the human mind. And again, this is where things get really complicated because the human mind is a very complex, misunderstood system within the body. So in order to try to understand this thing called the human mind, we developed a field of science called psychology. Psychology basically is the study of the human mind. And when we look at psychology, it basically describes the person in three different areas. And when we look at these three different areas, we see this is where the symptoms of our dual diagnosis tend to come out. So we're going to look at how a person thinks about things, how a person feels about things, and then their specific behaviors or how they act, right? And we can see this is where we get the term behavioral health. In the end, treatment and recovery is about learning how to manage specific behaviors. But we can do that by addressing thought processes, our emotional experience, and then those behaviors as well. So again, that's the first characteristic of these illnesses, is that there is something that's not functioning properly. And we can see that there is a biological process going on, and then there's a psychological process going on as well. The second characteristic of illnesses is that they have reliable and predictable symptoms. All illnesses are defined or characterized by the symptoms that they manifest. A reliable symptom basically means that it occurs consistently across different cases. So if I pull 10 people into a room that have a major depressive disorder, what we'll find is that they share many of those symptoms. So they occur consistently across those different cases. And that's how we basically make a diagnosis. A predictable symptom is a symptom that occurs consistently across time. So a good example would be if I have a major depressive disorder, which occurs in episodes. When I have an episode in December, I'm going to exhibit pretty much the same symptoms that I exhibited in the episode that I had in May or in June. So we can see that those symptoms occur consistently across different cases and will occur consistently across time. The second, or the third characteristic that we're going to look at is a concept called chronicity. So we're going to look at chronic versus acute illness experience. So a chronic condition is a condition that occurs over a long period of time. When I ask my clients how long they've had depression, very often they'll say, well, I've had it most of my life. So we can see how it occurs over that long period of time. And with those chronic conditions, we often will experience acute episodes of that symptomology. A good example of that would be if I have a generalized anxiety disorder with panic attacks. That generalized anxiety disorder occurs over a long period of time, but every once in a while I'll have this acute experience of the symptoms of that anxiety. So we can see with a lot of our dual diagnosis, not only are they chronic conditions, but we'll have acute experiences of the symptoms. The fourth characteristic is that these illnesses tend to be progressive. Most chronic illnesses will get worse over time. This can often be discouraging, which is why we emphasize the idea that they are very treatable illnesses. Even though they're getting worse over time, if we can effectively apply the treatment protocols, what we find is that we can minimize the impact of those symptoms on our lives. One of the difficult things to understand about this idea of progression is that even when I am effectively treating my illness and I'm minimizing the symptoms, underneath it all, that disease process or that morbid process continues to unfold. And this is important to remember because once we get into this process called recovery, it's something that we have to sustain over time. I cannot stop treating that illness once I develop an effective treatment regimen. Which leads us to the final characteristic of an illness, And that is with our chronic illnesses, is they tend to be uncurable, but very treatable. And we do have very effective treatments for our dual diagnosis. We call them evidence-based practices, which are treatments that have been researched over time. And we can see over time too how our understanding of medications, that brain chemistry has developed as well. So in the end, we have very effective treatments for these illnesses.